The slap echoed through the community center like thunder. Grace knelt beside her father's casket when her stepmother's hand struck her face so hard the room fell silent. Her cheek burned, but she didn't cry. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. All she had done was help an old man in a wheelchair. He had been struggling at the door in the rain while everyone pretended not to see him. Grace couldn't walk past someone in need. It wasn't in her nature. What she didn't know was that the helpless old man wasn't helpless at all. He was her father's attorney, watching, testing, judging. And her one act of kindness had just changed everything. Would this moment of compassion lead to her greatest blessing, or her heaviest burden? 3 hours earlier, the rain had started falling over Port Harcourt. Heavy drops drummed against the roof of Grace Okonkwo's small apartment as she buttoned up her black dress. Her hands shook slightly, not from cold but from the weight of what today meant. Her father was dead. Emmanuel Okonkwo, the man who had built an empire from nothing, was gone. And today they would bury him. Grace stared at herself in the mirror. At 24, she looked tired. The past 6 years had aged her in ways that didn't show on her face but lived deep in her eyes. Ever since her father married Victoria, life had become a careful dance of staying quiet and staying out of the way. Victoria wasn't cruel in obvious ways. She didn't yell or throw things. Instead, she used words like knives, cutting in private where nobody else could see. She made Grace feel small in her own father's house until Grace finally moved out into this tiny apartment across town. The funeral was at the New Hope Community Center, a building her father had helped fund years ago. Grace arrived early, before the crowds, before the noise. She wanted a moment alone with him. The casket sat at the front of the room, polished wood with brass handles. Inside lay her father in his good shirt, the one he wore to church and important meetings. He looked peaceful, but Grace knew better. Her father had never been at peace. He had always been planning, watching, building something bigger. She knelt beside the casket and placed her hand on the cool wood. "I wish we had talked more," she whispered. "I wish I understood what you wanted from me." People began to arrive. Family members she barely knew. Business partners who smiled too much. Church members who had suddenly become very concerned about the family's well-being. And Victoria, dressed in expensive black with a veil that covered her face but not her intentions. Victoria took her place at the front, playing the grieving widow perfectly. She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. She accepted condolences with grace. She looked like she belonged there. Grace sat quietly in the second row, behind Victoria and her relatives. Nobody came to sit with her. Nobody asked if she was okay. She had become invisible in her own father's funeral. That's when she noticed the old man. He sat outside in a wheelchair, struggling to open the heavy glass door. Rain soaked his clothes. His wheelchair kept slipping backward on the wet concrete. He looked desperate, frustrated, alone. Grace looked around. The funeral attendants stood just inside, watching but not helping. Victoria's eyes passed over the old man as if he were part of the furniture. Family friends suddenly became very interested in their phones. Grace felt something tighten in her chest. This wasn't right. Her father had always said that character shows clearest when nobody's watching, when there's no reward for doing the right thing. She stood up. Victoria's head turned sharply. "Grace," she said quietly, a warning in her tone. "Sit down." But Grace didn't sit down. She walked past her stepmother, past the rows of people who pretended not to notice, and pushed open the heavy door. "Please come in, sir," Grace said gently, holding the door wide. "There's space inside." The old man looked up at her with tired eyes. "Thank you, daughter," he said softly. His voice was rough, worn down by years. Grace helped guide his wheelchair through the door and found him a spot near the back. She gave him a program and made sure he was comfortable before returning to her seat. That's when it happened. Victoria's hand came out of nowhere. The slap landed across Grace's cheek with such force that her head snapped to the side. The sound cracked through the air like a whip. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. The entire room held its breath. Grace stayed on her knees, one hand still resting on her father's casket. Her cheek throbbed with pain, hot and stinging. But she didn't touch it. She didn't move. She had learned long ago that showing pain only encouraged Victoria. "You embarrassed us," Victoria hissed, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "On today of all days. What will people think?" Grace slowly lifted her eyes to meet her stepmother's gaze. She saw something there she recognized, not anger but fear. Victoria was afraid. Afraid of losing control. Afraid of what people might think if they saw weakness. "I was just helping someone," Grace said quietly. "You were making a scene," Victoria snapped. She turned to the crowd, pressing her hand to her chest in false distress. Please forgive her. Grief makes people act strangely. Murmurs rippled through the room. Some people nodded in agreement. Others looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Nobody stood up for Grace. Nobody ever did. Grace rose to her feet slowly, steadily. The same way she had moved through life since her mother died when she was 12. The same way she had survived 6 years of living under Victoria's roof before finally escaping to her own apartment. She looked at her father's casket one more time. Emmanuel Okonkwo, business owner, community builder, a man who had started with nothing and built something remarkable. To the neighborhood he was a legend. To Grace he had been complicated, a father who was there but distant, who watched but rarely spoke. Her cheeks still burned, but the pain kept her present. It kept the memories from drowning her. A flash came anyway. She was 16, standing in her father's small office behind his barbershop, holding a bank statement she wasn't supposed to see. Victoria's voice behind her, smooth as oil. You need to understand, Grace. This isn't personal. It's just business. That word, business, had followed her everywhere since. Business decisions were made without her. Business conversations she wasn't invited to. Business that somehow always benefited Victoria. Now that same woman stood in her expensive black dress and imported wig, having just slapped her in front of everyone who mattered. The service continued, but it never recovered. Prayers were lifted. Songs were sung. People kept sneaking glances at Grace's face, which was already beginning to swell. Nobody came to check on her. Sympathy had limits in this neighborhood. Only the old man in the wheelchair kept watching her. And his gaze didn't feel grateful. It felt deliberate, purposeful, like he was studying something important. When people started filing out after the service, phones came out too. Grace could see it happening. The slap was already traveling through group chats, spreading through the neighborhood like wildfire. Context would be lost with every forward. By evening, the story would be twisted into something unrecognizable. Grace stood near the exit, listening to the rain start up again outside. The sky had grown darker. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Behind her, the wheelchair creaked. Miss Okonkwo, a voice said. Grace turned. The old man looked up at her and something had changed. His eyes weren't cloudy anymore. They were sharp, clear, focused with an intensity that caught her off guard. Thank you, he said, his voice stronger than before. For earlier. Grace nodded. Of course, sir. It was nothing. It was everything, he replied quietly. She didn't understand what he meant. Didn't know why his stare lingered. Didn't know why her chest tightened, not with fear, but with the strange feeling of being truly seen for the first time in years. What Grace didn't know was that decisions had already been made. Files had been opened months ago. Lawyers had been instructed. Her father had been watching everyone for a very long time, and he had seen exactly what he needed to see. The test was already over. The old man watched Grace walk away into the rain, her shoulders straight despite everything. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder with her name written across the top in Emmanuel Okonkwo's handwriting. Inside were documents that would change everything. A will. Transfer papers. Account numbers that would make most people's heads spin. She passed, he murmured to himself. Even he would be surprised by how well she passed. 2 days later, Grace received an email. The subject line read, Estate reading, attendance mandatory. It listed a law office address in the business district of Port Harcourt and a time, 10 a.m. sharp. Grace read it once on her phone, then deleted it. She would go anyway. Showing up was what she did. It was all she had ever done. What she didn't expect was that showing up this time would cost her everything she thought she knew about her father, her family, and herself. Would the truth set her free, or trap her in a prison she never asked for? The law office smelled like old paper and polish. Grace arrived exactly on time, wearing the same black dress from the funeral. She hadn't bothered to buy something new. Money was tight and she had learned to make do with what she had. The building was one of those renovated colonial structures that tried to look modern but couldn't hide its age. The walls were thick. The ceilings were high. Everything felt heavy with history and secrets. Victoria was already there when Grace walked in. She always arrived early. Control started with being first, picking the best seat, setting the tone, making everyone else adjust to her presence. Victoria wore gray instead of black. Morning was over. Now came business. Her lawyer, a thin man named Bernard who talked too much and charged too little, sat beside her whispering reassurances. Victoria barely listened. Her eyes were fixed on the long conference table and the folders placed at each seat. Grace's name was printed on one of them, the same size as Victoria's. That seemed to bother Victoria more than it should have. Grace entered quietly, no announcement, no escort. She took her seat at the table and folded her hands. She didn't look at Victoria. Didn't look at the lawyers. Her eyes settled on a framed quote on the wall. "Character is what you do when nobody's watching." Her father's words. He had said that to her once when she was young, before everything changed. The door opened. The old man from the funeral walked in. No wheelchair this time. He walked smoothly, upright, deliberate. He wore a dark suit that fit him perfectly and carried a briefcase that looked almost empty but somehow felt heavy with importance. The room went completely still. Whispers started immediately. Someone gasped. "Wait, that's the man from..." He set his briefcase down at the head of the table with a quiet thud. When he looked up, his eyes were clear and sharp, nothing like the tired old man who had struggled in the rain 2 days ago. "My name is Mr. Chukwu," he said, his voice steady and unhurried. "I am the senior executor of the Emmanuel Okonkwo estate. No dramatics. No theatrics. Just fact." Victoria's face went tight, then smoothed out fast. She was good at controlling her expressions. "I don't understand," she said carefully. "You were in a wheelchair. You looked. You were being tested," Mr. Chukwu replied simply. "A process your husband put in place 14 months ago." He opened his briefcase. Inside were more folders, identical to the ones already on the table. "Mr. Okonkwo believed that character shows clearest when there's no reward in sight," Mr. Chukwu continued. "Especially when kindness costs you something." Grace sat perfectly still. She didn't move. Didn't react. Her hands remained folded on the table, but her heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Mr. Chukwu glanced at her once, briefly, his expression neutral. Then he turned back to the room. "The will is structured in stages," he said. "We'll go through them one by one." He pressed something on the tablet in front of him. Phones buzzed all around the table. Emails were dropping simultaneously. Subject lines popped up on screens around the room. Account status update. Authorization change. Asset transfer notice. Bernard frowned at his phone, scrolling fast. His face went pale. "This has to be a mistake." Mr. Chukwu didn't answer right away. He waited until everyone had seen it. Waited until the reality began to sink in. "The Okonkwo family trust has been activated," he said calmly. Another buzz, louder this time. A woman at the end of the table stood up fast, nearly knocking over her chair. "My access is blocked. I can't get into the accounts." "Yes," Mr. Chukwu said. "Access has been reassigned." Victoria's phone rang. She ignored it. Then it rang again. And again. Her hands started to shake. "What is this?" she asked, her voice sharp with rising panic. Mr. Chukwu looked directly at her. For the first time, there was something other than neutrality in his eyes. It looked almost like sadness. "This," he said slowly, "is your husband's final decision. Made while he still had hope you would prove him wrong." He slid a document across the table. Not to Victoria. To Grace. Grace reached for it without hesitating, though her fingers trembled slightly. The first line wasn't a dollar amount. It was a sentence, handwritten and scanned into the record. "If you're reading this, then someone chose right when it would have been easier not to." Her father's handwriting. She would recognize it anywhere. Her fingers tightened on the paper just once, then relaxed. Around her, the room started breaking apart. Bernard's phone buzzed again. He went pale as he read the screen. "Victoria," he whispered urgently. "Your accounts. They're frozen." "Frozen?" Victoria snapped, standing up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. "What do you mean frozen?" "All corporate privileges have been revoked," Mr. Chukwu said calmly. "Pending review." "Review of what?" "Of everything." Grace sat still. She didn't smile. Didn't look shocked. She just listened as the world shifted around her. The power didn't explode. It happened quietly, through emails, through authorizations, through systems correcting themselves after years of looking the other way. And for the first time since the funeral, Grace understood something clearly. This wasn't a gift her father had given her. It was a reckoning that had been set in motion long before he died. But what would it cost her to claim it? The meeting ended without ceremony. Mr. Chukwu closed his folder, stood and left the same way he came, calm, unbothered, purposeful. The door clicked shut behind him, and that sound felt more final than any judge's gavel. Nobody followed him. Nobody knew what to say. Victoria sat frozen for 10 full seconds. 10 seconds was forever for a woman who was never last at anything, who always controlled the room, who always had the final word. Her phone kept buzzing, But each vibration got shorter, quieter, like even the phone was giving up on her. Grace stood when it felt right, when chairs began to scrape, when people started pretending things were normal. She picked up the single document Mr. Chukwu had given her and placed it carefully in her bag. She didn't look at Victoria. That hurt worse than any words could. Grace. Victoria's voice cracked on her name. She stood now, unsteady on her expensive heels. Her perfect makeup couldn't hide the fear in her eyes anymore. You knew. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation trying to become an excuse. Grace paused. She didn't turn all the way around, just enough to acknowledge that Victoria had spoken. I knew my father, Grace said quietly. That's all. Victoria laughed, sharp and bitter. Don't do that. Don't act like this wasn't planned. Don't act innocent. Grace met her eyes then. Her face was unreadable, not cold, not kind, just present. Planning means intent, Grace said. I just showed up. She left. Outside, the city kept moving. Cars honked in the usual Port Harcourt traffic. Music thumped from a passing bus. A woman sold plantain chips on the corner. Power had shifted. Empires had changed hands. And the world didn't even pause. Grace's phone buzzed as she walked to the bus stop. Okonkwo Family Trust. Executive access granted. Board meeting scheduled, 24 hours. She turned the phone face down and kept walking. That night, Grace sat in her small apartment, the same one she had lived in for the past 3 years. It wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, old carpet, a kitchen where the sink leaked if you ran it too long. She had never moved back into her father's house after he married Victoria. Distance had been her only control, her only power. Now that distance was disappearing whether she wanted it to or not. Emails poured in. People who had never responded to her before suddenly found her contact information. Cousins she hadn't heard from in years. Church members who wanted to check in. Business associates offering congratulations and advice she hadn't asked for. Grace ignored all of them. Instead, she opened the secure file Mr. Chukwu had unlocked for her and started reading. There were layers she hadn't expected. Companies hidden inside other companies, silent partnerships, non-profit organizations that weren't quite what they seemed. Money moved in circles that looked clean on the surface but weren't when you dug deeper. And underneath it all, a pattern. Not of generosity but of watching. Her father had been paying attention for a very long time. He had seen things. Recorded things. Prepared for this moment long before his death. Grace closed the laptop just after midnight. Her head ached. Her eyes burned. She dreamed of the funeral, not the slap but the moment before. When she reached for the door and felt the choice settle into her hands. In the dream she hesitated. In the dream she walked away. She woke up with her heart pounding and sweat on her forehead. The next morning Victoria's world kept shrinking. Her car service didn't show up. Her credit cards were declined at the store. The doorman at her building hesitated before letting her through, his eyes flicking to a screen she couldn't see. When she called Bernard, his assistant said he was unavailable and asked if she could try next week. Next week. As if she had time to wait. By noon the blogs had picked up the story. Okonkwo estate shakeup. Widow loses control in surprise succession. Speculation filled in where facts were missing. People loved a good downfall story, especially when it involved money and family drama. Victoria sat alone in the house she had redecorated twice and no longer owned. Everything around her, the furniture, the art on the walls, the expensive rugs, suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. Because it did. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon her phone rang. She answered on the first ring, desperate for any contact. I want to talk, she said before the other person could speak. Silence. Then Grace's voice, calm and distant. About what? You destroyed me, Victoria said, the words coming out flat and empty. And you did it quietly. That's worse. Grace closed her eyes. Not in pain but in acknowledgement. You weren't destroyed, she said carefully. You were corrected. Long silence stretched between them. You let him test me, Victoria said finally. You stood there at that funeral and let him humiliate me. Grace leaned against her kitchen counter. I didn't know who he was, she said honestly. Neither did you. You always knew you were different, Victoria shot back. Special somehow. Grace thought about that. Different isn't the same as ready. Another pause, heavier this time. Did you want this? Victoria asked, and for the first time she didn't sound angry. She sounded afraid. Grace didn't answer right away. The question deserved honesty. I don't know yet, she said finally. The call ended. Grace stood in her kitchen long after, phone still in her hand, facing a truth she hadn't expected. Power answered questions she had never asked. And now she had to live with the answers. 3 weeks later, Grace stood in front of a boardroom that felt like ice. Not the temperature, the design. All glass and steel and empty space between people. The table could have seated 40. Only 12 showed up. Grace took the center seat. Nobody objected. Nobody spoke. Mr. Chukwu stood to her right, tablet in hand. He didn't introduce her. Didn't need to. Everyone in this room already knew exactly who she was and what had happened. The first thing on the agenda wasn't profits or expansion plans. It was accountability. Over the last 10 years, Mr. Chukwu said, his voice filling the quiet room, several accounts were used in ways that went beyond their stated purpose. Screens lit up around the room. Charts appeared. Numbers scrolled past. Transactions were stripped of their excuses and presented as simple evidence. Grace watched in silence. Her face showed nothing, but inside her stomach twisted. A man at the end of the table cleared his throat. These were approved under Mrs. Okonkwo's authority, he said carefully. At the time, they were within acceptable range. Acceptable isn't the same as right, Mr. Chukwu replied. Grace shifted slightly. The small movement pulled every eye to her. The room held its breath. Pause, she said quietly. The screens froze. Silence gathered around her like it had been waiting for permission to exist. How many people lost their jobs when these funds were moved? Grace asked. Mr. Chukwu glanced at his tablet. Around 800. Indirectly more. Grace nodded once. Her jaw tightened. Bring them back. Confusion rippled through the room like a wave. Someone laughed nervously, thinking she must be joking. That would require undoing several active restructures, a woman in a business suit said. It's not that simple. I know, Grace said, meeting her eyes steadily. Do it anyway. Mr. Chukwu nodded. No argument. No explanation needed. Just instruction. Emails started sending before anyone could argue further. The board moved forward, unsettled and uncertain. After the meeting, Mr. Chukwu walked with Grace down the hallway that overlooked the city. From up here, people looked small. Movement without faces, lives without stories. You could have left things as they were, he said quietly. Nobody would have questioned you. The business is stable. Grace stopped and rested her hands on the railing. Below, Port Harcourt stretched out in all directions. Crowded, loud, alive. That's the problem, she said. Nobody was questioning anything. Mr. Chukwu studied her carefully. Your father believed pressure reveals truth. Yes, Grace said. Pressure also breaks things that were never supposed to carry weight. He said nothing to that. There was nothing to say. 3 weeks later, Grace stood in a warehouse that used to sit empty and dark. Now it hummed with life again. Forklifts moved boxes. People called out to each other. Lunch trucks lined the street outside. A man approached her, wiping grease off his hands with a rag. He was older, maybe 50, with tired eyes that had seen too many disappointments. They told us you brought us back, he said. That we got our jobs again because of you. Grace nodded. Yes. He hesitated, looking at her like he was trying to understand something that didn't make sense. Why? The question landed heavier than thanks ever could. Grace considered several answers. None felt complete or fully honest. Because it was wrong, she said finally. He smiled, not grateful but relieved. That's rare, he said. Somebody just saying that without a whole speech behind it. Without trying to look good. That night, Grace sat in one of her father's houses for the first time. It was too big, too quiet, filled with furniture that looked expensive but felt cold and empty. In his office she found a locked drawer. Inside was a notebook with her name written on the first page in her father's handwriting. She read until the sun came up, her coffee going cold beside her. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a confession. It was a record, observations, doubts, plans within plans. Pages about people he had trusted, then crossed out. Pages questioning whether wealth could ever be passed down without corrupting something good. One part stopped her cold. She read it 3 times. If you're reading this after I'm gone, then you've been tested by circumstances I created. I hope I was wrong to think this was necessary. I'm afraid I wasn't. Grace closed the notebook. For the first time since the will reading, something inside her cracked. Not outwardly, just a pressure behind her eyes that she refused to name or acknowledge. The next morning Victoria showed up unannounced. She looked smaller somehow. Not weaker, just reduced. The expensive clothes couldn't hide it anymore. You planned this, Victoria said once they sat down. No games. No masks left. My father did, Grace said. I just was myself. Convenient, Victoria said bitterly. You won either way. Yes, Grace replied honestly. That's what makes it hard. Victoria laughed softly, a sound without humor. You don't get to feel guilty and powerful at the same time. Pick one. Grace met her eyes. Why not? Silence filled the space between them like something physical. Victoria stood. You won, Grace. But don't pretend you didn't want to. After she left, Grace sat there long after the door closed. The systems had worked. Injustices were being corrected. The business was stable. People had their jobs back. But for the first time, Grace wondered if precision without mercy was just another kind of inheritance, one she never chose but now carried. And she didn't know if that made her her father's daughter, or something else entirely. 18 months later, things were quiet. That was the victory. The Okonkwo businesses ran smoothly. Disputes dropped. Audits passed. Grace's name appeared in headlines only when necessary, usually next to words like steady, effective, or unemotional. She wasn't photographed smiling. She wasn't asked to speak at leadership events. The market trusted her. People weren't sure what to think. Grace sat in her office watching a quarterly report. Mr. Chukwu stood at the front of the room, older now or maybe just tired. The transition is complete, he said. By every measure, the estate is healthy. Applause followed, polite, professional, empty. Grace didn't clap. Afterward, Mr. Chukwu met her in the hallway. You succeeded where most would have failed, he said. That's not flattery. That's fact. She nodded. Facts balance eventually. He studied her carefully. And personally? Grace thought longer than she should have. I sleep, she said quietly. Just not deep. A month later, she received a letter. Handwritten. The sender was a man whose department had been cut during the early freezes. Not corrupt. Not stealing. Just caught in the middle. You were right to fix things, he wrote. But my son doesn't believe systems care about fairness anymore. He thinks they only care about what works. I don't know if you taught him that or the world did. I just know he learned it when we lost everything. Grace folded the letter and put it in the drawer with her father's notebook. That night, she stood outside the New Hope Community Center where the funeral had been. Same steps. Same doors. She tried to remember the exact weight of that moment 18 months ago. She couldn't. Memory had been edited by consequence. Her phone buzzed. Ethics review closed. No action required. She turned it off. Later that week, she ran into Victoria at a charity event. Victoria looked adjusted, not recovered, not defeated, just there. You built something impressive, Victoria said. It just doesn't love you back. Grace thought about that. Did it ever love you? Victoria smiled fondly. No. But I thought it needed me. Silence settled between them. You know, Victoria said quietly, if you had stopped him, if you had refused the test, you would still be who you were that day. Grace met her eyes. And how would I know that? Victoria strength. You wouldn't? That's the cost. They parted without forgiveness. Months passed. Grace started funding something new, not through the trust, not under her name. A legal defense network for people hurt by restructures they never controlled. Mr. Chukwu warned her it would never scale. That's the point, Grace said. On the anniversary of her father's death, Grace returned to her old apartment. She opened the notebook again. On the last page, her father had written, "Power shows you who you are. It doesn't ask permission first." Grace closed the book and looked outside. Port Harcourt kept moving, indifferent, operational, alive. She had inherited an empire and dismantled a woman. She had corrected injustices and created new wounds. She had passed a test she never agreed to take. In the quiet that followed, one question remained. If mercy lets wrong survive and justice requires cruelty to work, which failure do we live with? Grace didn't have the answer. The empire endured. What she would become was still unwritten. We've come to the end of today's story. I hope it touched your heart. Thanks for watching and staying with us till the end. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. See you in the next one. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from?